Hi everyone, welcome to Moody Monica Mondays, and I want to start this video off by saying a big thank you to everyone who has liked, commented, followed this page as well as my main page, and lastly as well as reached out to me personally after my introduction video last week. I am absolutely overwhelmed and grateful with all of the positive responses I have received, and thank you so much, because I really am excited to embark on this journey with everyone. And that being said, I also wanted to provide a formal trigger warning for this video because it is a very long and vulnerable one. I am exposing myself quite a bit, but I wanted to be able to do so we can create this understanding that absolutely nothing is off the table. I want to be able to have an absolutely open, unashamed conversation about mental health. So here we are, and I just wanted to provide that trigger warning with substance abuse as well as self-harm and suicide. And please just view this at your own risk, and only view if you are absolutely comfortable with it. So that being said, as well, this week will be structured just a little bit differently. That is why this video is coming out on a Sunday, and that will be explained in the next few days. I'm really excited to provide you with a few extra things this week. So that being said, without any further ado, my name's Monica and this is my story. So I want to start my story by talking about the beginning, timeline-wise, as in from when I was a kid. I was described as a very independent child. Not that I had much of a choice, to be honest. Both my parents were fresh off the boat and trying to create a life for us. And so I spent the first little bit of my childhood in Poland. Following that, when I came back and started school, I didn't get much time to play with other kids due to not having siblings until the point I was 8 years old. So I spent a lot of time alone. And of course, living in a rural place and my parents being both very foreign in a small community, it was difficult to kind of bond and reach out with people. But anyway, that being said, up until the age of 12, I do not have a single memory of my own. I do not remember anything about my childhood. My first memory that I can recall is from being 12, and that memory there is not a fond one, but definitely something, once we get into discussions about certain topics, would love to be able to share that when we can have a conversation about that. But anyway, that being said, 12 is the earliest I remember having a memory. However, I remember having a feeling, a certain emotion, that my earliest recollection is probably about 8 years old, is when I remember just feeling anger. This explosive anger that had no rhyme or reason, came out of nowhere, as described by my parents, and it was just kind of something that was really hard for them to control and get an understanding of, but just kind of rode them out as per them happening. But anyway, continuing on, I started to become aware of myself feeling a bit different than other kids once I started high school. So at the age of 14, when we enter grade 9, I felt out of place. I felt wrong. I was just constantly trying to find my spot. And that was whether it was in a certain group of people or in a sport or in my relationships or outside of school. Just, I always felt like I was the extra, the not the main person in the story. And so I just kind of floated. I floated throughout high school, and what I understand that people mostly remember me by is just being happy and a nice person. And I'm very thankful that that's the way I'm viewed. And however, I just kind of cruised. I just was preoccupied with one thing in high school, which was more or less being in a relationship. And that I've come to understand that my searching for a person was just the lack of dynamic that I had of viewing a relationship at home. And that is just because of the way my life was, in the sense of my parents' relationship and everything like that. But I felt this longing for a connection with someone because I just always felt like I was the third in the group kind of thing. And I, from a young age, was constantly looking for validation through relationships. So whenever I was in one, I thought I was happier, that I was more fulfilled. And that came from this need of feeling validated. Hi, Maverick. Feeling validated emotionally. And whenever I wasn't in a relationship, I felt vulnerable, I felt empty, and I was constantly looking for that next feeling of validation. And so high school was that kind of give and take of feeling validated and then not feeling validated, and trying to realize that I was just filling a void of some sort. I was feeling this void of not knowing who I was, and I was constantly just floating. Now, because I didn't exactly have a model relationship to look on, to compare to with my own, I became more and more fearful of abandonment. I would do things that I would not, as a right mind, do now to salvage a relationship because of the fear that they would leave. I thought in every aspect that this is the best I can do. This is it. If I can't salvage this, then I'll be alone forever. And that was such a hard thing to accept once I finally realized that I was doing it over and over and over again. And I always found myself in the same situations. So moving away from high school to university, I started at McMaster, and I commuted for the first couple of years as well as worked full time. So therefore, I didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time building relationships with my peers at school. I worked into an industry that gave me a different option. I still got to enjoy all of the partying and excitement. However, it was not a healthy place for me in the long run, which brought me into a world of partying, drinking, using drugs, and I got consumed by that. So I had left a really long-term relationship and fully consumed myself into this void, which I thought was helping me at the time, but shown to really harm. Now, as I did with many relationships, I always felt very empty afterwards. I felt I had given everything of me to that person, and then I was left as an empty shell. So when I got the opportunity to join a group of people that I worked with and indulging in certain activities, those activities filled that void and made me feel good. So I didn't see it as an issue. So I continued going on the path that I did, but would find over days to weeks to months that I was experiencing weight gain, weight loss, either sleeping so much or not at all, as well as falling behind on my studies at school, spending a lot more time focusing on work than I did with school, and then of course spending a lot of time doing things that I shouldn't have been doing. And it made me feel good about myself, because when I was involving myself with the wrong things, I was finally getting noticed. I was finally feeling like I was the main character of the story. So I grasped onto that high. I grasped onto this feeling of importance, that people could actually see me, that I wasn't just someone off to the side, because to me, I didn't feel like I was a person. So when people saw me or people talked to me, I felt validated. And that's how low my self-esteem was. Now, as you can imagine, that validation only goes so far. So I found myself in a relationship with someone who really destroyed the rest of the self-esteem that I had, and went through a lot of pain with. And that was due to making me feel very vulnerable and making me feel very unlovable, and as well as just that I was an option. That's all it was. And that really plays games on you, because as someone who would fight tooth and nail to keep something going instead of learning how to let go, I let it get the best of me. So once that was finally over, I was left very wounded. And what did I do after that one? Feeling super wounded and not taking the time to heal, I just jumped into another relationship, because that's what I thought would bring me happiness. And I got into a relationship with someone who could sense, I guess, that I was very wounded, and then molded me into the person that they wanted me to be. That being said, this person made me feel terrible about myself for my indulgences and the things that I would spend a lot of time and money on. During that time, I was dealing with an extremely impulsive behavior, and realizing that that impulsive behavior was something that was following me my entire young adulthood. And if that was either shopping or drinking or drugs or anything, I wanted it, I needed it, and I spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars trying to fill that void. So once again, this person made me feel that the way I was living was wrong. And to an extent, he was correct. And, but at the same time, I kept just shutting the door and pushing on, not recognizing what my problem was, and that was my diminished mental health. So this is where we're going to start getting into more of the deep stuff. So I'm in this relationship that has made me feel extremely insecure about all of the decisions I've ever made, and therefore made me feel ashamed of everything I participated in. So with that shame and that anger and disgust and guilt that I felt towards myself channeled to me from this person caused me to push everything down, make it go away, and hope that it would just stay there. But as you can imagine, it didn't, and it all exploded. And it all started with self-harming. So once I realized that the emptiness started to feel overwhelming. It started to feel there, even though I was in a relationship, which is usually what made it go away. So it came back, and every single day it took a little bit more out of me. And I got to the point of feeling absolutely nothing. The relationship made me feel nothing. The alcohol made me feel nothing. The drugs made me feel nothing. And so when I resorted to self-harm, even though it was pain, I felt something, and that's all that mattered at the time. So when that was happening, I was able to grasp onto something, which then became something that I, of course, hid, which then made me feel extremely insecure about my body because I wanted to hide what I was doing to myself. And so it really started to conflate with my self-image because I had always been extremely self-conscious about my body, but it was to a point where I just wouldn't show myself to anybody. And I started locking myself away, and I started to put on more clothes than necessary. So the next thing that started to happen was this loss of control of my emotions. So the industry that I was in that gave me opportunities to indulge in things that weren't exactly good for me, I also learned very well on how to leave my baggage at the door. So I was very, very good at concealing what was going on, even if I was going through the worst possible moment or worst possible day. I was able to leave that at the door and do what I needed to do and present myself as a happy, smiley, friendly person. And when I learned that I couldn't mask what I was feeling anymore was when the panic attacks started to happen. And they would happen at any point in time. They would happen when I was at work. They would happen when I was in a grocery store. They would happen when I was driving. I just started to lose all control of my emotions, and that caused a rift in between me and my family because I became extremely, extremely unpredictable because they didn't know who they were going to get on a daily basis because my emotions would skyrocket from the lowest lows to the highest highs within minutes. Following these panic attacks, I lost the ability to look people in the eyes. I felt so embarrassed about the person I had become, or lack of a person, I should say, where I was covering my body up from the scars I had given myself. I was riding this emotional roller coaster where I had zero control. These panic attacks that made it so debilitating to be able to leave my apartment that I just shut myself out, and I wouldn't let anybody in, my family and boyfriend at the time included. Therefore, I started to go down the deep path of suicidal ideation, where I was so sick of being a burden to the people around me, and that I was no longer able to provide the service I was at work. And that made me feel crushed, and I felt like I was better off not being there than having the people in my life go through that with me. And the nail on the coffin for that feeling was the day that I had made a plan for myself. Now, before I get to that actual day, I want to just back up a little bit and talk about when I finally told my mom what I was feeling. So my experience with talking about mental health growing up was that it wasn't real, that it wasn't for people like me who was provided with a lot growing up and was not coming from a terrible home, and that I should be grateful for everything that I have, and why be depressed when you can just work through it. And so I had a very difficult time coming to my family and telling them that I was experiencing depression. And it was very difficult for me to accept that I needed help in the first place because of what an independent person I have been for my entire life. But something that I will say very often in the upcoming episodes and videos and everything is that of being a crutch. So something that really got me through asking for help was that I told myself that I had a broken leg, that I just needed a crutch in order to help me heal my broken leg, and then one day I'll be able to walk again all by myself. And that's what I compared asking for help with my mental health was comparing it to that broken leg, and using help as using a crutch in the same scenario. So it made it a lot easier to get through. So at that point in time, my mom saw what a difference I had become over the last few years, and took me to see my family doctor. That experience was very, very difficult because my doctor didn't view depression as real either, and he told me something that will forever be very hurtful, and why I want to be able to do something different in the mental health realm in order to be able to help. Because when I told him about what I was feeling, he accused me for being a drug addict, and that's why I felt the way I felt, rather than using those indulgences as a way to help me not feel what I was feeling on a daily basis. And then told me that because I wasn't religious, God had given me demons, and in order to make them go away, I should pray. And that was the end of that conversation. And my mom, thankfully, was able to stand up for me at that time, because I was a shell of a person. I couldn't look at anybody. I couldn't speak for myself. I was done. And that point in time, I was put on Cipralex, which is an antidepressant. And that, with a combination of a couple other things, had unfortunately pushed me over the edge. And that was what brought me into what I'm going to be talking about next. So on March 3rd, 2019, I made an attempt to take my life. I had made this attempt a bit impulsively. It was something I was thinking about for quite some time. However, the build up to it was kind of the nail on the coffin of emotion overload. So I went from having a very difficult night the night before. It was my final shift at the place that I had given a great portion of my life to. I had a severe panic attack that cost me a very dear position to me, and unfortunately put me in a very difficult position. And the next day, that day, I had an argument with the person I was with at the time, and they asked me why I was so fucking sad all the time, and then left. So I was alone, and I was on an emotion hyperdrive, and I jumped in the car and went for a drive to a store to buy the things I needed to buy. But because I was experiencing an out-of-body experience, I didn't realize how fast I was going and got pulled over. This police officer came up to me and I was hysterical. I was crying. I was just telling him I wanted to go to sleep, and I just couldn't look him in the face, and I just kept crying. And all he did was just write me a ticket and then leave. And that was the last human interaction that I had before being found on the bathroom floor. And during the time of that experience with that officer to coming home was a bit of a blur. I just engaged in what I engaged in and started experiencing my own personal version of hell. I kept, after I had taken what I had taken, I started experiencing extreme hallucinations, and I kept repeating all of the traumatic things that had happened over the last few years that brought me to this point over and over and over and over again in my head, and I couldn't make it stop. And the last hallucination I had was that I met death, and I took his hand, and he told me it wasn't my time yet. And that's when I woke up. I woke up and I was surrounded by my mom, my sister, and my boyfriend at the time, and I was so distraught by the look in their face that I had done something terrible. And I realized that I had hurt them, and I had hurt them in the way that I finally realized that my family wasn't upset with me being a burden, and that the choice I had made would have just moved my pain over onto them. It made me realize that I needed to find a way to defeat what was happening to me, to beat the pain I was feeling, the nothingness I was feeling, and it brought me closer to myself in that moment. And in that moment, I knew I had to get better, and I needed to succeed against this fight with my depression and the pain and the trauma that had happened over the last few years. And that is a story that I will be so excited to share with you next week about the uphill from March 3rd and where my journey has taken me since then. But until that time, stay strong, and thank you so much for being here with me, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.